preservation people who were fighting a good fight to keep them from knocking down every nice old building on 14th Street and throwing up something new and ugly in its place. So whatever you do to support them, please do. Okay, so my book's about the huge role that New York City played in the Civil War, which is, I think, rather underreported in traditional Civil War narratives nowadays. And so I'm going to talk some about that. I'll talk a lot about that. But I'm going to focus on a few figures who have Greenwich Village connections because we're here. 3 of them were part of the neighborhood's bohemian scene in the late 1850s and early 1860s. James Redknapp, Fitz-James OBrien, and the one we all know, Walt Whitman. And I'm going to mention a few other villagers who played dubious roles during the war. So, New York played a huge role in creating the conditions for the Civil War and in the conduct of the war. But it was a hugely confused role as well. It was huge because New York City itself was huge. We don't quite, I think, appreciate now how New York City dominated urban space in America in the 19th and most of the 20th century. It was vastly bigger than anybody else. Washington was the nation's political capital, but New York City was the capital of the nation in just about every other way it mattered. For one thing, it was by far the most populous city in the country. There was 800,000 people here in 1860. Here, New York City means Manhattan in 1860 because the other boroughs weren't attached yet. And it really means Manhattan is the lower half of Manhattan. Above 42nd Street, things got pretty lonesome. So you're talking 800,000 people, mostly below 14th Street, really kind of crowded down here. Brooklyn, which was a separate city, had another 250,000 people in it. So if you consider that a metropolitan area, it dwarfed all the other cities. Philadelphia was far behind. I think there was 600,000 people in Philadelphia. Washington was like 75,000 people in 1860. But New York was also huge in a whole lot of other ways. It was the center of banking and finance in the country. There were more banks in Manhattan than there were throughout the South. It was the center of merchandising. It was the biggest manufacturing center in the country. We don't think of New York as a factory town, and it wasn't ever a traditional factory town. And yet there were more factories, more manufacturing in New York City than anywhere else, and that went on into the 20th century. It was the biggest and by far the busiest seaport in the country, and it was the media center. New York's newspapers, like the Tribune and the Herald, went out around the country, and they were really the national newspapers at the time. I'd say that it played a hugely confused role in the Civil War, because New Yorkers, in a lot of ways, were fighting their own Civil War amongst themselves at the same time. And in some ways, it was even a north-south conflict within the city. From the south came cotton. Cotton, before 1800, cotton was not an important commodity. It was very easy to grow in the deep south, but picking it out in the field and then cleaning it were maddeningly, devilishly slow handwork. So it just wasn't very economical. In the 1790s, with the invention of the cotton gin, which at first was just a little hand crank machine that spun the seeds out of the flax. Then they hooked up a steam engine to it. And once they did that, the cotton trade exploded in the 1800s. The U.S. exported 500,000 pounds of cotton in 1800, and by 1860 it was up to 2 billion pounds. Cotton represented 60% of what the U.S. exported to the rest of the world, and it was 40% of what New York Harbor shipped out. So it was a huge deal. Meanwhile, down south, even though they figured out the cotton gin, well, it was a New Englander patent, you still had to pick the cotton by hand out in the field. That meant armies of cheap labor, and that meant the continuation of slavery in the South, and a growing importance of slavery to the South. Cotton threads tie New York and the South together in a long and codependent relationship. That's a line from the book. It always sounds kind of phony when I say that. When you write it. The explosive growth of the cotton plantations across the South, all the way into Texas, was mostly financed by New York banks, because this is where all the banks are. So of course you came here for your loans. The New York merchants supplied the plantation owners with everything from the pianos in their parlors to their plowshares to the clothes they put on those slaves out in the field. And then New York shipped a significant amount of the cotton out. Those ships, when they mostly went to New England or to England, those ships that went to England came back loaded up with European goods that were then sold by the New York merchants. So it was a daisy chain of profits going on. It wasn't just the bankers and the big shipping magnates and the big merchants in New York who were tied to cotton. Thousands and thousands of workers were dependent on cotton as well. Dock workers, obviously, but also shop workers and workers in the hotels where the Southerners came and stayed in the summer months. Southerners treated New York City as their home away from home in the summer because it was so hot down there and nobody had air conditioning. There were, in addition to the 800,000 New Yorkers in New York in 1860, before the war started, there were 100,000 Southerners visiting that summer. So it was a huge crowd of Southerners. All these people who were involved in all those jobs, from the hotels to the banks to the docks to the whorehouses and the gambling houses and the theaters, were tied in one way or another to cotton. They were dependent on cotton, which meant they saw it in their best interest to maintain the plantation system and be friendly to the South, which meant they saw it in their best interest to keep slavery in the South. And then New York workers also feared that if anybody ended slavery, the 4 million enslaved people in the South would all come rushing up to the North and take their jobs away. So there were, because of cotton, the majority of New Yorkers, not all New Yorkers, but the majority of New Yorkers were very pro-South, very anti-abolition. They were what were called Copperheads, which was Northerners who were sympathetic to the South. On the other side, there was a small but very vocal and influential core of abolitionists in New York City. So that's the North being represented because a lot of the white abolitionists in New York City were Yankees, New Englanders, who had come down mostly for the business opportunities represented in the big colonies. New England was being a hotbed of abolition at the time. Many of them were prominent businessmen themselves, and in fact, not a few of them were making their fortunes directly or indirectly from the cotton trade, which meant from slavery. They were uneasy about that, and they would vote abolitionists, but they put the money in their pockets anyway. One of the most important of them, or at least one of the most visible of them, was Horace Greeley, known as Uncle Horace or Uncle Hal, the founder and editor of the New York Tribune, which was for a while the biggest paper in the country. We all know him from the Go West young man, but he was in fact vastly complicated and eccentric man. He was probably bipolar. He would go from high highs to very low lows, what were called brain fevers in those days. He was very flighty in his opinions. One day he'd be for the war, the next day he'd be against the war. He played a key role in getting Lincoln into the White House, and then he bedeviled the poor man the whole time he was in the White House. And they were just, everybody in Washington was real sick of Horace by the end of the war. Horace brings up one of our guys with a village connection, James Redknapp. Not a name very recognized today, but very recognized in his day. Redknapp was kind of a classic fiery, red-headed Scotsman. He came to America as a boy with his family from Scotland, and he was 19 when Horace Greeley saw his writing and hired him for the Tribune. So as a kid, he starts hanging out at Fap's, the basement rathskeller on Broadway near Bleecker, where the city's first celebrated and self-celebrated bohemians gathered to eat, drink, and carouse. They were poets, they were journalists, they were theater people, and among them he met Walt Whitman, and they became lifelong friends, and Fitz-James O'Brien, whom I'll come back to in a minute. In the 1850s, Redknapp travels throughout the South, sending secret dispatches back to Greeley at the Tribune and to some of the abolitionist newspapers about the conditions in the South. He comes to the conclusion that if given the right impetus, the slaves would rise up in armed revolt against their masters. That conclusion sends him out to Kansas a little later in the 1850s, where pro and anti-slavery forces were in an honest-to-God border war. They were fighting one another along the border. Out there he meets John Brown, the grand old man of Arlen Revolt, and becomes a devoted follower, and takes up arms himself to fight against the pro-slavery forces. Meanwhile, he's still writing articles to the Tribune. This was long before anybody thought that journalism should be, not have opinions. After Brown's failed raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859, Redknapp wrote a bestseller about it that basically called him the new Jesus. Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859 was almost the last straw for the Southerners. The last straw was the election of Abraham Lincoln in November 1860. And Greeley and the New York abolitionists played a big hand in that. Plymouth Church over in Brooklyn Heights was a center of Yankee abolitionists. Their pastor was Henry Ward Beecher, the famous abolitionist preacher. They invited Abraham Lincoln to come speak at the church in February 1860. He was such a dark horse at that time that New York newspapers couldn't even get his name right. Some of them spelled it, calling Abram Lincoln. Some of them gave up just calling A. Lincoln. And he had not announced his candidacy yet because he had no idea if he had any chance of ever getting elected to the presidency. Because he was so obscure, the Plymouth churches got cold feet. Because churches in those days were for-profit institutions, they were not non-profits. So if you invited a speaker, you needed people to come and pay to see him, and you didn't want to have a flop. So they got cold feet. Greeley and some of the other abolitionists in New York City, in Manhattan, said, fine, we'll bring him over here. And they brought him to Cooper Union in Manhattan. That speech he made at Cooper Union in February of 1860 is arguably the most important of his career. That was one of the biggest. He also got his picture taken that day by Matthew Brady. And so that picture and that speech are reproduced all around the country, introducing him to a lot of Americans who had no idea the day before who he was, and his ideas, because the whole speech was printed. It's been said that if it weren't for that picture and that speech in New York City in February 1860, the historical figure we know as Abraham Lincoln probably would not have existed, because he had no chance of being elected president. Still, although New York State voted for him in November of 1860, New Yorkers and Brooklynites did not. They voted against him with 2-1. And they did so again in 1864. The only ward, the city was political wards at that point, that voted for Lincoln in 1860 was the 15th ward, which was the area around Washington Square. It was known as the Empire Ward because it was all wealthy, a lot of Yankees, a lot of businessmen, and a lot of Republicans, he being a Republican. The whole rest of the city voted against him. The instant Lincoln was elected, Southern states started to secede because they were convinced that he was going to try to force them to give up their slaves, even though he said over and over again that that was not his intention. They start to secede. New York's business leaders panic. Secession would mean the end of their lucrative trade with the South, as well as leaving them holding the bag for about $150 million in Southern debt. $150 million in 1860 is, like $4.5 billion today. So it was a lot of money that they were going to be out. So when Lincoln passed through the city on his way down to Washington after being elected, New York City gave him a very cold reception. Walt Whitman writes about how cold and silent the audience was when he got out of his cab to go into his hotel. And he got a lecture from the mayor, Fernando Wood, who famously suggested that if the South was seceding, New York should secede as well and become an independent, sovereign city-state that could do business with the South, even if there was a war. Mayor Wood was widely condemned for that, though it was not the first or the last time that the idea of a free city of New York was raised. Norman Mailer raised it when he ran for mayor in 1969. And just last week in the New York Observer, someone raised it again in an op-ed. All right, it's me. We should at least revisit the idea. And in my and Mayor Wood's and Norman Mailer's defense, more grandly wacky themes for how New York City should deal with the rest of the country have been raised. The same month that the mayor made his speech, January of 1861, an NYU law professor named William B. Wedgwood published a pamphlet called "The Reconstruction of the Government of the United States, a Democratic Empire Advocated and an Imperial Constitution Proposed." His idea was that to avert civil war, he proposed dividing the country into 2 or 3 general republics within a democratic empire, with New York City as the imperial capital. It's not a bad idea. Here is his bad idea. It would be a Christian empire that would encourage all forms of religious expression except, quote, the worship of idols and the sacrifice of human beings, which would probably veil references to Catholics worshiping idols and Jews who were accused of sacrificing human beings. So, okay, so we leave that part out when we think about imperial cities. For all that they had feared and tried to stave off the war, New Yorkers of all types flocked to sign up when the war started in April 1861. For one thing, they were signing up for 3 months. A lot of people thought that the war would only last 3 months. These guys would get a uniform, they'd get a musket, they'd march down south, they'd kick some butt, and pleasantness would be over in 3 months. So it was an adventure for a lot of people. For working class New Yorkers, it was a job and a paycheck. Unemployment was already high after a big depression in 1857, which was called the Panic of 1857. And then with the start of the war and the cutoff of the cotton trade, there were a lot of people thrown out of work. So they were up for a paycheck, any kind of paycheck, and were willing to give them a uniform to take it. One of the very first to sign up was Fitz-James O'Brien, one of the guys from FAPS, from the Bohemian crowd. A Tribune writer called him one of the cardinals of the High Church of Bohemia. Born in Ireland, son of a prosperous lawyer and landowner, when his father died, O'Brien grabbed his handsome inheritance and ran with it to London, where he probably squandered it living the high life. Then he came to New York penniless in 1852. He was a prolific writer of journalism, poetry, fiction, plays, and spent most of what he earned partying at FAPS and other places with his friends. When drunk, O'Brien often escalated a literary argument into a bout of fisticuffs and would spend the night in the Jefferson Market jail. So the Civil War began with the shelling of Fort Sumter on Friday, April 12th. On Friday, April 19th, the first New York troops left the city to go for the defense of Washington, because Washington was in fact surrounded by the South. They were the 7th Regiment of Volunteer Infantry. They were known as the Darling 7th, the Silk Stocking Regiment, and the Kid Glove Regiment, because all the cream of New York society had sons in the 7th Regiment, and marching right in there amongst them was Private Fitz-James O'Brien. He kept them amused by writing and singing fake Irish ditties about them. He would later help recruit another volunteer unit, the McClellan Rifles, they were called, in which he held the rank of captain. In November 1861, he made the news for shooting one of his own men. The Times reported that a Sergeant Davenport, quote, who is said to be the most desperate and unruly man in the regiment, attacked O'Brien, who was forced to shoot him in the belly. Shortly after that, O'Brien left the Rifles and joined the regular army, where he was a lieutenant and was posted to West Virginia. In a clash with a Confederate patrol in February 1862, he and a rebel officer exchanged fire. The rebel died and O'Brien's left arm was shattered. He died a long and agonizing death, not from the wound itself, but from lockjaw contracted when the doctors operated on him, which happened a lot those days. His body was brought back to New York in April of 1862, where the 7th gave him a hero's funeral and interred him with full honors at Greenwood Cemetery. He was 33 years old. As New York businessmen had all feared, the start of the war in April of 1861 did indeed bring economic disaster at first to the city. The waterfront went silent, shops closed, thousands and thousands of people lost their jobs. But New Yorkers being New Yorkers, they turned it right around, and by the end of the summer, that very summer, New York was having a boom time. It started mostly because New York banks gave the federal government a very large loan for Lincoln's war chest. Now, the cynical interpretation of that, and I think when you're talking New York City banks, the cynical interpretation is quite often the right one, was that they were feeding the war machine so that, in fact, the war would be over very quickly, and they could get back to doing business with the South and collect that $150 million in uncollected debt. At any rate, the federal government turned around and spent a whole lot of that money back here in New York City and in Brooklyn. They bought medical supplies from Squibb and Pfizer, who were little companies in Brooklyn at the time. The waterfront got busy building and fitting out warships of every description. Businessmen replaced the cotton they didn't have anymore with wool, beef, lumber, and other commodities from the West. So they're forced to diversify, and they are. There was a great deal of war profiteering as well. For instance, the government bought uniforms from the Brooks brothers, who were a pretty young company at the time. Wool, the uniforms were supposed to be wool. Wool was very expensive at the time. So the Brooks brothers substituted a material called shoddy. Shoddy was rags that were wetted and pressed together and then shaped to look like clothes, and that was your uniform. The first time you marched in the rain wearing shoddy, shoddy was a noun when the war started, but as the war progressed, it became an adjective. And war profiteers and other millionaires who were making unfair amounts of money on the war were called the shoddy aristocracy. For the first couple of years, the war went very badly for the Union, for the North. December 1862, the Union Army took a terrible drubbing from Robert E. Lee at the Battle of Fredericksburg. And that brings us to the most famous guy from the Fast crowd, Walt Whitman. Walt had a kind of 2 degrees of separation connection to John Brown, as a matter of fact, not through his pal James Redknapp, but through John Brown Jr. Walt frequented in the late 1850s the Fowler and Wells Phrenology Cabinet on Broadway near City Hall. Lorenzo and Orson Fowler were the leading promoters in America of phrenology, which was then not yet ridiculed out of all consideration. Whitman, Greeley, Beecher, and a lot of other progressives all looked into phrenology as a way to answer the phone. Okay. Sorry if that happens to me. But they saw it as a path to self-knowledge. You know, you were feeling the bumps on your head and figuring out your strengths and weaknesses mentally. Whitman wrote for the Fowler's magazines, they published several. When Walt self-published his first edition of Leaves of Grass, and the greatest poetry book published in America yet today, in 1855, the Fowler shop was one of the very, very few that carried it because it was considered obscene. John Brown, then, this brings us to John Brown Jr. He was working for Fowler's and Wells at the same time that Walt was, and so I think it's quite possible that they crossed paths at that point. All right, so now we're back to December 1862. The northern newspapers are running long lists of men killed, wounded, or missing from Fredericksburg, and Walt sees his younger brother George's name on the list. George was a lieutenant with the 51st New York Volunteers. Walt rushed out of the family home in Brooklyn and went to Washington, where he found that, in fact, George was all right. But he decided to stay in Washington. And during the course of the war, he would make many visits to, pretty much daily visits to the hospitals, the military hospitals, serving as an amateur nurse's aide and a kind of one-man unpaid USO. He wrote and read letters for the men. He handed out fruit, tobacco, and whatever money he could. He read from the Bible when they asked for it, or he would just sit, talking or not, and occasionally hold their hands. And he said, he wrote that once in a while he took a fancy to one of the young men. Walt received no pay for these visits and wrote to friends up north for donations. James Redknapp asked the help of Emerson, Thoreau, and those other literati in Boston who were all aware of Walt as a poet. He found them squeamish about sending Walt money to be spending time with the boys in the hospital. They were aware not only of Walt's poetry, but of his sexuality, and doubtful that his motives were entirely altruistic. Redknapp wrote Walt, quote, "It is believed that you are not ashamed of your reproductive organs." And somehow, it would seem to be the result of their logic that eunuchs only are fit for nurses. Okay. So, now after the initial flurry of signing up at the start of the war, the horrors of battle, once you'd seen the elephant, was the term for those days. Once you'd seen battle, seen the horrors of it, volunteers in the city went, and throughout the north, as a matter of fact, it went down to the trail. Then the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation changed the agenda of the North's war from preserving the Union, which is what Lincoln had always said the war was about, to ending slavery, which was a goal many New Yorkers had absolutely no interest in fighting and dying for. They wanted slavery to continue. So volunteerism goes even lower. And a lot of New York soldiers and officers go AWOL. They refuse to fight in the war anymore after the Emancipation Proclamation. Because of that plummeting volunteerism, again, not just here, but throughout the North, Lincoln was forced to begin conscription in the spring of 1863. The draft allowed a man to buy his way out of service for $300. $300 was the average working man's annual wage. Meanwhile, wartime inflation had doubled the cost of everything that the average working family would buy, a loaf of bread, a wheel of cheese, whatever, while their wages had stagnated or actually dropped. So they had a lot of grievances building up in the first couple of years of the war, and they saw the draft as the final insult with its $300 buyout for the rich men. The first drafted men's names were drawn in New York City on a Saturday in July. And what they did was they put your name on a slip of paper, they put it in a big wheel, they turned the wheel, a guy reached in and pulled out some slips of paper. One of the newspapers called that wheel the Wheel of Misfortune. So they draw the first names on Saturday. The working men think about it, and grumble about it, and drink about it all day Sunday, which was their only day off. Monday morning, they riot. It's still the most deadly rioting in the history of the United States. One historian has noted that while the draft was the immediate spark, it's a little misleading to call them draft riots, which we all do, because it was truly more of a citywide workers' revolt. They had just had one. Officially, 119 people died, though many New Yorkers believe that that number was very low. Another younger brother of Walt's, Jeff Whitman, wrote him from Brooklyn, quote, Undoubtedly, we shall never know the full number, but I have it from the very best authority, an eyewitness of most of the fights, that there are now more than 400 rioters that have paid their lives for their plunder. The papers are not allowed to publish this. I suppose it is much better not to let it be known. And soon, not long after that, the Whitman family was scrambling to come up with $300 to keep Jeff out of uniform. Workers weren't the only anti-war class in the city. Several of the city's newspapers, newspaper editors were vehemently against the war. Lincoln had several New York City newspapers shut down, and a few of the editors arrested during the war. And one of them was a man named John Wilkes Booth, who edited a fiercely anti-war paper and anti-black and anti-abolitionist paper called, curiously, Freeman's Journal. He went from opposing Lincoln and his war to outright treason. And here's how that happened. In October 1864, 8 Confederate saboteurs filtered into the city. Their plan was to set New York City and Chicago ablaze simultaneously. And then Copperheads all throughout the North were going to see that as the signal fires, and they were all going to rise up in an armed revolt and end the war and join the South. When they got to the North, they met with McMaster at his office, and he assured them that up to 20,000 local Copperheads were armed and ready to rise up. All they had to do was light the fires. On the night of Friday, November 25th, 1864, they went around to hotels and other public places in the city, including Barnum's Museum, and tried to set them alight using a material that was called Greek fire. It was the 19th century napalm, except it didn't work anywhere near as well as napalm does. It smoldered and it smoked, but it didn't catch fire, so it didn't do any real damage. There was, a couple of hours of panic when people saw smoke coming out of all the hotels and out of the Artist Museum, and then they realized nothing much was going on, and everybody went back to having a Friday night in New York City. And obviously there was no Copperhead revolt throughout the North. That fizzled out too. The saboteurs fled to Canada. One was captured and brought back to New York City and hanged at Fort Lafayette. One of the hotels they tried to burn down was next door to the theater, where the famed Shakespeareans, Edward and John Wilkes Booth, and their brother Junius, were appearing on stage for the first and only time together, all three of them, in a benefit performance of Julius Caesar. John Wilkes' original plan was not to assassinate Lincoln, but to kidnap him and hold him for ransom for the release of Confederate POWs, so that the South could continue the war. He shared that plan with a few New Yorkers who didn't bother to report it to any of the authorities. And apparently bought a small cache of rifles and handguns from one of them, who and possibly was the Copperhead owner of a violin shop in Greenwich Village. So that's another New Yorker and Greenwich Villager committing treason at this point. Across the street, across Broadway, from the theater where the Booth brothers were doing their historic performance, Laura Keene was performing as well. Laura Keene was an actress, and but possibly more importantly, said to be the first woman in America. She was British, but she had come to America years before, to be her own independent theater producer and impresario, and built her own theater, a beautiful white wedding cake of a theater right across the street from the Booth Theater. In 1858, she had had a giant hit with a silly little farce called Our American Cousin. In 1865, she'd do a one-night revival of it in Washington, D.C. on April 14th, almost exactly 4 years after the war started. The Lincolns had tickets to another show, but when they heard that Our American Cousin was happening, Mary Lincoln said, no, let's go see that. So they attended, and so did John Wilkes Booth. Lincoln was still on his deathbed when a military commission began to investigate the assassination. And pretty soon they interviewed a character actor from New York City named Samuel Nat Chester, who had performed with both Edmund and John Wilkes Booth in the past. In December 1864 or early January 1865, Nat wasn't sure, he said that John Wilkes Booth picked him up at his boarding house at 45 Grove Street, just off Bleecker Street. They walked down to one of the several English-themed ale houses that were on Houston Street back then. This one was called the House of Lords at Houston and Crosby Street. And inevitably, there was another one called the House of Commons. Booth told Chester about his plot to kidnap him, and he was still plotting to kidnap him at that point, and offered him the quite large sum of $3,000 to help him pull it off. When Chester refused, Booth swore him to secrecy, warning that, quote, if I attempted to betray them, I would be hunted down through life. Chester testified that Booth visited him again on Friday, April 7th. That was 1 week before the assassination. They went again to the House of Lords, sat around drinking beer and eating oysters, and Booth told Chester that he'd been to Lincoln's second inaugural and rued that he had not killed him right there and then. But according to Chester, he said nothing about his actual plans to assassinate Lincoln a week later. I know of no record of why Chester failed to report any of this to the authorities. Maybe he really was worried for his life. Maybe he was a copperhead. He went on with a very long acting career. On retiring, he would live his last 16 years in the Actors Fund home on Staten Island, where he died at the age of 87 in 1921. Walt Whitman was staying with the family in Brooklyn when the assassination hit, with the news of the assassination hit. He wrote in a notebook, Lincoln's death, black, black, black. As you look toward the sky, long, broad, black, like great serpents, slowly undulating in every direction. Walt was very moved by Lincoln's assassination. A lot of New Yorkers were not, but Walt was. And you can see it in his poetry. Walt's poetry is, from then on, from 1865 on, is a very different, more mannered, more It's not leaves of grass. James Redknapp was in Charleston, South Carolina when the assassination happened. Charleston, where the war began. He had spent the war as a frontline correspondent. When the Union Army took the city of Charleston, he was made superintendent of schools in the occupied city. And it was there, shortly after, that he organized the first observance of what we now know as Memorial Day. 20 years after the war, James Redknapp, who had fought against slavery with John Brown, began working with Jefferson Davis, the former president of the Confederacy, on his memoirs. Davis died before the project got very far, and Redknapp worked with his widow, Verena Davis, on completing the book. It was 2 volumes. It was dreadfully dull and didn't go anywhere. But Verena liked New York enough from coming up to visit to work on the book, that she, the first lady of the Confederacy, moved to New York, was quite well received. A lot of former Confederates were well received in New York after the war. They were called Confederate carpetbaggers by New Yorkers. And she died here in 1906. The South kept trying to get her to come home, come home, come home. She wouldn't do it. She finally did go back. She's buried in Richmond. In the end, for all the resisting and complaining and rioting and seditious activities that New Yorkers got up to, the war was, on balance, very good for New York City. Businessmen seized the opportunities it presented to amass capital, to expand their markets, to diversify they started building the railroads out west. You know, the West was not won by the cavalry, it was won by New York bankers who sent all that money out west. They laid the foundation for the booming growth of New York City in the Gilded Age, which was extraordinary growth, which set the city on its course to become what it became in the 20th century, the capital of the world. And that's where I'll stop. Thank you.